Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at Morphy's with an MP-18-1 with Schmeisser's box magazine improvement to it. Now, when the MP-18 first saw combat use, when it was first developed during World War I, it was built around a Luger quote-unquote snail drum magazine, a round single-stack 32-round capacity drum that had been originally developed for the artillery Luger. It was a magazine that was available, that was in production, and thus made logistical sense for the German military to use, despite being expensive, way too complicated, and just a really awkward magazine. So, in the aftermath of World War I, it makes sense that these guns would have been upgraded to use a much more modern style of magazine, namely a simple box magazine. However, the story is not quite as simple as you might think. So, the designer of this gun was one Hugo Schmeisser. And during World War I, he had been working with the Bergmann company, Theodor Bergmann. Now, after World War I, Germany loses its right to have automatic weapons, essentially. It's allowed some machine guns, but light machine guns and automatic rifles are prohibited to the German military by the Treaty of Versailles, and that includes submachine guns like the MP-18. So there's not really much opportunity for a company like Bergmann's to be making and selling these things in Germany. Instead, they need to look to other places. So Bergmann actually licenses the design, which he has the rights to. He licenses it to SIG in Switzerland. And SIG would spend about 7 years, from 1920 until 1927, manufacturing their version of the gun, which they call the SIG Model 1920, for countries like Finland, Japan, China, and a few others. Schmeisser is really quite unhappy about this arrangement. It's not exactly clear why, but probably because the license doesn't give him what he considers a suitable royalty for his developmental work. I don't even know if he got any royalty from it. That would certainly explain why he was unhappy with the arrangement. So he and his brother Hans decide to ditch Bergmann. They leave the company and they start working with the Haenel company instead. Now, they initially try to basically acquire the Haenel company. The family that owns it isn't interested in giving it up, but the two brothers essentially become overall management for Haenel while leaving technical ownership to the Haenel family. So Hugo is in charge of weapons development and Hans is in charge of things like material procurement. And they would stay with Haenel for decades. Hugo Schmeisser was designing the MP-44 for Haenel during World War II. At any rate, what they do when they first get there, among other things, is design their own box magazine update to the Bergmann MP-18s. And they did this with an idea of modular, well, maybe not modular, but a variety of calibers being able to be used. There was potential use for police to use submachine guns. The German police forces were allowed to have those under Versailles. Not a lot of them, something on the order of 1 gun per 20 officers, like one submachine gun per squad or company. I'm not sure exactly what the designation would have been for the German police, but small numbers could be used by the police, and there was a potential to perhaps sell these to some other countries as well. So that's what he did. Let's take a look at what this multi-caliber thing entails in practice and how this conversion was done. I want to reiterate that these are converted early MP-18s. They were not made from scratch. So aside from the magazine well, the features that you see are going to be MP-18, essentially World War I era MP-18 features. And that covers things like the rear sight. Later iterations of Schmeisser's submachine gun, the MP-28, would have a tangent sight on them. But all of these conversions, these early MP-18 Schmeisser magazine conversions, will have a 2-position flip sight like this one. The receivers are marked Theodor Bergmann of Waffenbau Suhl. Bergmann was, of course, the original manufacturer during World War I. And you will see serial numbers that are World War I production. So only a couple thousand MP-18s saw frontline service, but a couple tens of thousands were actually produced before production ended at the very end of the war. Just most of them didn't quite make it to the front lines in time. So 22,000 is well within known World War II production. Now, this magazine well is essentially the heart of the update. This is the new thing that Schmeisser designed. The original magazine well had an angled magazine well coming back here to take that trommel drum designed for the Luger. Now, when they did the update, Schmeisser put back on, included the original style of marking. So it's still marked MP-18-1. Now, with System Schmeisser, that refers to the box magazine, which is also marked System Schmeisser. The original serial number of the gun was replaced here. However, any potential 1920 mark was not. So when these guns were put into German government service, they were marked with the number 1920 as an indication that they were government property. And on the MP-18s, this would have been for police use, they would have been marked 1920 right here and 1920 on the side of the stock. Now, this stock has been sanded down very slightly, but we can still see the 1920 stamp on the stock. The original magazine well would have also had it, but there was no reason for Schmeisser to put it on years later when they updated this gun to the box magazine system. We'll talk about the years later part in a little while. Anyway, we also still have the original serial number here on the receiver tube, the Imperial proof mark on there, and in fact this is, as far as I can tell, a completely matching gun. The bolt matches as well. Now, the magazines that were developed, we have the same style of magazine release there. This is a 20-round box magazine. And we got the numbers there. You got witness holes every 5 rounds. And notice that this magazine has a spacer in the back. The magazine was made long enough for any cartridge up to 9x25 Mauser. At this time, 9x19 wasn't necessarily as the dominant, obvious cartridge that it is today. There were submachine guns being made in other calibers, like 7.63 Mauser from the broom handle Mausers, 7.65 Parabellum, essentially 9mm Parabellum neck down to 7.65, 9x25 Bergmann, 9mm Largo, 9x23. So Schmeisser designed this to theoretically be able to fit any of those cartridges. This magazine would go on to be the heart of the MP-38 and MP-40 submachine guns, and by extension, the Sten guns. And a lot of people will ask, why would he have done a single stack magazine? Double stack magazines were known at this point. For example, the C96 Mauser has a double stack magazine. And I think the best answer to that is he wanted to be able to convert MP-18s without having to, well, by doing as little as necessary to the gun. So the magazine well can come off and a new one can just be dropped on as a replacement part. If you have a single stack magazine, then you can leave the bolt as is. That Luger drum that was originally used required a single stack, well, was a single stack magazine, and so the bolt was designed to feed only from a single position magazine. By duplicating that again, Schmeisser greatly simplifies the work involved in converting an MP-18. Had he known that this magazine would go on to be involved in so many more guns for the German military, I think there's a decent chance that he would have put more work into making it a better style of magazine, which is to say double stack and double feed. But he didn't, and then Germany ended up keeping essentially this pattern of magazine, not quite identical, but keeping this pattern for a very long time. We have what I don't know exactly what this organization is, but I believe that's a police unit mark down there on the magazine. Again, System Schmeisser, made by the Haenel company. Unfortunately, this gun has a broken extractor and a couple of the screws up here on the trunnion are missing. It's got one over there, but it's missing the other two. Also worth pointing out that the magazine wells for these conversion guns are marked on the very front, CG Haenel Waffenfabrik Suhl, for the Haenel company that manufactured them. There's surprisingly little information out there about these post-war conversions of the MP-18. You'd think there'd be more, but there really just kind of isn't. One of the most common misconceptions, I think, is that this update was something that was done uniformly across the board, widespread, and very quickly after World War I. And to a person who's just focused on the gun technology, that would make sense. The trommel drum, snail drum magazines were obsolete when they were first introduced. They're weird, they're complicated. You would want to immediately update them to a modern box magazine. However, remember that Germany was economically devastated in the aftermath of World War I, The Army's not even allowed to have these things. They're only going to police forces. The police don't have the money to dump into upgrading guns that, frankly, while the magazines may be awkward and clumsy and expensive to make, they're already in hand and they work well enough as it is. So a lot of police forces never did update their MP-18s. Some did. The Prussian police, for example, did upgrade to the Schmeisser magazines, but they didn't do it until 1931. The German military never updated its MP-18s. The Wehrmacht in World War II still had some MP-18/1s using those snail drum magazines. So yes, some of the guns were updated, exactly like this one. This is actually a really good example of one that was a Weimar police property gun as marked on the stock, would have originally been marked on the trommel drum magazine well, and at some point it was updated to Schmeisser's box magazines. The new magazine well doesn't have the 1920 stamp. That all fits very nicely, and this is a really good example of the type. But it's important, I think, for people to realize that this isn't a universal gun. There are lots of MP-18s continued in their original configuration through the 1940s. Now, Schmeisser would go on to continue working on this pattern and would develop the MP-28 in 1928. That MP-28 uses this same Schmeisser box magazine. I have not had a chance to actually test this out in practice, but my understanding is, from the references, the early 20-round MP-18 Schmeisser magazines will work in MP-28s. When Schmeisser developed the MP-28, he also came out with a longer 30-round or 32-round magazine for it. Those are not backwards compatible with the MP-18s because of some slight changes that were made in the magazine well design. So you will see MP-28s with both long and short mags. I don't think those MP-28 long magazines would work in this gun. At any rate, Schmeisser was able to sell some MP-28s, not a whole lot of them, but it was enough to sustain the business, obviously, until they did some other things. And Haenel was a company that was going strong in weapons development right up into World War II. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, a little bit of background on what happened to the MP-18s after World War I. Thanks for watching.